Y'all got any more of them startup drafts?
When you're walking and talking and freaking and yelling and bossing and speaking and looking at a boy, no one tells what to do with your high top shoes and your wavy toes with the black shorts. Don't let them get away. Don't think they can play and nail them to the wall because you really need to say, gotta go free me, back up, bring me my right back, turbo jacket. He said, when you're walking and talking, but he's faster than me. Shout my walkie-talkie man. Last night at the show. When you're walking and talking.
Welcome into another edition of The Worst Fantasy Show. I am your host with the least, Jack Lucene. As always, no ads, no sponsors, none of that bullshit, just the fantasy facts. So if you want to help support the show, you got to super kick that subscribe button. And most of all, send in some comments, send in some questions, send in some ideas for shit you want to see on the show. And you can send that to either my socials at Jack Lucene, or you can always send them to worstsportschannel@gmail.com. We've got a jam-packed show today. We are going into Dynasty draft values. It is Dynasty startup season. There's a lot of rookie drafts going on, but there's also a lot of startup Dynasty drafts going on. I am in one right now as we speak. I used that league and a combination of a mock draft and a little bit of the underdog best ball ADPs as like a good mix so that I could really get some proper context and conjecture for this list of draft values. So the way I'm going to present this is we're going to go 10 rounds. We're going to go round by round. What are my favorite values per round? Now, the big thing about this, before we get into this list, there are no quarterbacks on this list. The reason for that is because the entire list could have been just quarterbacks because it's such a deep position this year. And I'm very much on the side and fence of you need to be waiting on quarterback this year more than ever. In one quarterback leagues, this is especially important. But in super flex leagues, to me, it is almost equally important. Now, obviously, when you're talking about a super flex league, quarterback is king because if you have the ability to start two premier quarterbacks, that's generally an advantage over the rest of the league. However, once again, as I've said, this is a very deep position this year. I did not draft quarterbacks with my first couple of picks, which is something that I traditionally do in super flex leagues. Even I've been known to do the thing where I'll trade up and get two premier quarterbacks in the first round, and then I'll deal with the rest of my draft later. I've done the opposite this year. So I still traded up into the first round, but I actually attacked the skill positions. I took Bijan Robinson and CeeDee Lamb as two young premier skill positions to build my team around. And I waited until the 3rd and 8th round for quarterback in a super flex dynasty startup. And I got Dak Prescott and Baker Mayfield, which I'm perfectly happy with as my two starting quarterbacks. And then, I'll maybe take a look at some of the rookies. Now, I got late rookie picks, so I probably won't get one of the main 6 guys that were drafted. But I might be able to pick up on like a Spencer Rattler or something and kind of see where that leaves me in the future. But ultimately in super flex leagues, Brock Purdy went ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Breece Hall, Marvin Harrison Jr., and even CMC. Like, there is no chance I would draft Brock Purdy ahead of any of those players, even in a super flex format, because, again, the quarterback position is so deep. I don't think the difference between Brock Purdy and Baker Mayfield is really that big. I do think the drop-off of CMC and whoever you're drafting in the 8th round is going to be a much more significant gap, and you're losing a lot of fantasy value on the rest of your squad when you make those kind of moves. So me personally, again, I'm waiting on quarterbacks this year. I do have quarterbacks listed, so I have some honorable mentions that we will get into. So you guys are going to want to stick through because, like I said, we're going to do 10 rounds together, but then I'm going to just rapid fire a lot of honorable mention guys I like at the end. And the quarterbacks, I did these ones by position. The quarterbacks I did by Superflex rankings, and the rest of the skill positions I did single quarterback. So again, I just want to make it very clear that for the rankings, for the most part, for this show, for the rounds, I actually used primarily a single quarterback ranking because I feel like that is still the most widely used format. But I did also include Superflex based on, again, the active draft that I have going as we speaketh. So we'll start with my number one guy, my number one buy.
I'd buy that for $1.
So for me, this is, I'm targeting as my 101. I'm targeting as the guy in the first round. And famously, I was out on Bijan Robinson last season because I said at where Bijan Robinson was being drafted, he would have to have a historic rookie season to essentially prove out his ADP. Now this year, the draft capital really hasn't changed. You are still taking Bijan Robinson in the first round in dynasty leagues. He is still generally going ahead of CMC in what I would call more savvy leagues. So there are definitely going to be dynasty startups where you will see CMC go first. But I think in a lot of the leagues that I'm playing in, so for example, this dynasty startup that I'm in right now includes 4 other analysts from Fantasy Football Universe. So these are guys that are very in tune with what's going on. Obviously, they're doing shows, and these guys are grinders. So they're very stats driven. And, you know, even still, a lot of them, I think, have Bijan Robinson in a dynasty format because of the age and the optimism now, especially with this huge coaching change and shift in philosophies that's happened for the Atlanta Falcons. That's where I'm also projecting. It's not what has happened, it's what will happen. And I do think Bijan Robinson has the opportunity to finish as not just top 5, potentially top 3, and even the number 1 overall running back for the next 2 to 3 years. And again, I want to really hit on, it's not just the hiring of Raheem Morris for the Atlanta Falcons. It's the fact that they also brought over Zach Robinson as the offensive coordinator. He was in charge of the quarterback room and passing game essentially for the Los Angeles Rams, but he is directly from that McVay offensive learning tree. And that to me is why I'm so high this year on Bijan Robinson. Last year, famously, I was out because of Arthur Smith and the way that Arthur Smith likes to run his offense. To me, Bijan Robinson didn't necessarily fit the mold of what Arthur Smith wanted to do. It was more like Tyler Algier, honestly, that fit that role. With how they're going to be running the offense now, I would expect that, you know, you look at the success that they've had previously with even just last year with Kyren Williams, for example. Man, I'm very excited, very, very excited for Bijan Robinson in this offense, especially because the fact that they're loaded in the passing game with Drake London and Kyle Pitts, to me, is even better because you can't stack the box on Bijan, especially if Kirk Cousins is healthy, which I do expect him to be healthy. He's never been like a super mobile quarterback anyways, so I don't really think that the ACL will affect his arm or his throwing mobility for the most part. And we've already seen him. There's videos already of Kirk Cousins throwing the ball. So it just makes the Michael Penix selection even more questionable, because I definitely think they could have got a premier outside linebacker to really help their defense. But it is what it is. As far as Bijan Robinson goes, though, I think the other big opportunity is that he had 58 receptions last year, but it was on 86 targets. So again, if you take those 86 targets and you make those targets from Kirk Cousins as opposed to Desmond Ridder, I do think he's going to catch more than 56 of those passes, because Bijan Robinson has incredible hands. I mean, there's that amazing clip where he catches it literally. It's left-handed and it's a little bit behind him kind of on his back hip, and he catches the shovel pass with one hand and then just absolutely jukes the life out of some defenders. But yeah, Bijan Robinson 100% is going to be my target in the first round, and especially the way that the draft kind of breaks out and how many wide receivers. This is a loaded wide receiver class, especially with the incoming rookies. I'm more willing to wait on the wide receivers as opposed to the running backs, because I do feel there's a much heavier fall off for the running backs as you get into the later rounds as opposed to the wide receivers. And so I'm really targeting running backs heavy, early, and often this year, kind of going a little bit traditional. But we'll get into round 2.
Warning.
Ding, ding, ding. What do we have for her, Johnny?
The hate for AJ Brown has just absolutely gone too far. This ADP is, to me, absolutely ridiculous. He is going in single quarterback leagues at 2-2 and sometimes later, depending on, again, how much your league mates hate AJ Brown. But in the Superflex startup I did, he went at 3-4. To go in the third round in a Superflex league for AJ Brown is sanctimonious. This is just patently ridiculous to me. And yes, it was a rough end to the season, but unlike fellow superstar Stephon Diggs, this was very much like the entire team had a rough end to the season. Like the Philadelphia Eagles imploded on themselves down the stretch. Everybody essentially played bad. And there was even still a game where AJ Brown had like 7 or 8 receptions or something like that and 98 yards. So it wasn't like abjectly horrible to the degree that people are acting. And then on top of it, he still finished the season with 106 receptions and 1,456 yards and 7 touchdowns. Garrett Wilson, who was drafted at 111 in the mock draft that I did, where I got this ranking, and routinely, in a dynasty startup draft, the idea of age, I don't know what it is. People get so focused on the age factor. I would highly recommend, just general advice, I usually ignore age unless the guy is like legitimately like 32 or older, because I tend to play in shorter windows anyways. I play in 1 to 2 year windows in Dynasty because so much changes year to year in the NFL that if you try to go look at 3 years ago what the NFL looked like compared to this year, it's night and day. There's like 10 guys that are still on the same roster. You know, obviously there's more than that. It's hyperbolic, but so much of the landscape shifts in the NFL year to year. And in a 3 year gap, I would say probably 70% of rosters have changed. So, like I said, AJ Brown really, Garrett Wilson is where I was going with it. Will routinely and often go ahead of AJ Brown in a dynasty startup. And yet in 2 years with the Jets, Garrett Wilson has 7 touchdowns, and he has never really sniffed the yardage that AJ Brown had last year. Like, if you consider the fact that last year was a down year for AJ Brown, who had 106 receptions, 1,400 yards, and 7 touchdowns, then you're saying that, well, if they have a good year this year, he potentially could just repeat the same thing, basically like 100 receptions, 1,500 yards, and 10 touchdowns. So I think really the only question is, you know, whether the offensive line is going to be good enough to hold up compared to how they imploded last year, like I said, especially with the loss of Jason Kelce, who's now retired. But to me, it's like AJ Brown's coming back with the same team, except now with an upgrade at the running back position in Saquon Barkley. I feel like the Eagles are going to be just as good this year. So I love Jalen Hurts. I love Saquon Barkley. I love AJ Brown. Obviously, I'm going to be targeting him heavily in the second round, especially if he slips to mid-second round at all. But I even like Devonta Smith who traditionally I have not been as in on because, again, the ADP to me just didn't really match where I projected him to finish. The only guy I'm out on in this offense is Dallas Goedert. Dallas Goedert is mid. He's never going to do it. He's never done it. It's been like 8-10 years now. Do yourself a service and do not draft Dallas Goedert. If I was doing the reverse of this show of draft values I hate, that Dallas Goedert would be on the list. But no, AJ Brown in the second round, that's just pure money. Next up, though, we'll go round 3 to Green Bay. And I'm mathing up Josh Jacobs' projections, and I don't know how this man doesn't outdo a third round. So, in the single quarterback mock draft, Josh Jacobs going at 310. Like, he has potential this year to finish as a top 5 running back. You talk about a complete wide open opportunity with Aaron Jones leaving town, Josh Jacobs coming into town on a 4-year deal. And the only people he has to compete with is AJ Dillon, who's never done it, and Marshawn Lloyd, who I do like as a rookie, but he is a rookie day 3 pick. Or I think he might have been a day 2 pick, actually. Apologies. Yeah, I think he was day 2. But either way, he's a rookie day 2 pick. He's not going to take the starting job away from Josh Jacobs. And you say, oh, well, Josh Jacobs had a bad year last. Yeah, he had a bad year because he had really bad relationship with the Raiders who refused to re-sign him. He played on a contract year, played through some injuries, but clearly towards the end of the year, the relationship fell through and he was clearly going out of the building, so they started giving the work to Zamir White. And yet still, with all of that said, he still had 1,000 yards all-purpose last season. So I do expect landing in Green Bay with a chip on his shoulder, especially you start getting reports coming out of Green Bay that Josh Jacobs is like in really good shape. You're going to see that ADP start to creep and rise. So if you're doing dynasty startup drafts right now, I would be very in on Josh Jacobs in round 3. And again, this is where you're going to notice a trend is a lot of my earlier guys that I'm liking are running backs because you get in this range of wide receivers. There's Drake London and Nico Collins and, got Jalen Waddle, guys I don't necessarily believe in at that high of an ADP because, again, when I'm picking in that high second round still, or even in that third round, I'm trying to find the guys that I think have the path to finish top 5, top 10. And, a guy like a Jalen Waddle, I love his talent. Usually, though, I will have him projected as finishing like, okay, in a great year where him and Tyreek both succeed, I feel like Jalen Waddle has top 12 potential where he could finish at like 11 or 12, maybe top 15, but top 10, 2 top 10 wide receivers. Again, that's hard to, project when they also have all these running backs that they want to use. They bring in Malik Washington, Tua spreads the ball around. He's not the type to singularly target just Waddle and Tyreek back to back. So, those are the kind of situations where I look at a Josh Jacobs and I see he has a true path to legitimately like a 1,500 yard season. You talk about if he goes out and has 1,200 rushing yards because he got 300 plus carries for the Green Bay Packers, like, would that really be that surprising? I really don't think it is. And he's only 26 years old. So age isn't really a factor necessarily. And again, I apologize for not having the actual tweet pulled. It's just something that I remember seeing, that the idea of age versus tread on the tire. So, the amount of touches that a player has had during his NFL career, that's conjecture. That doesn't actually really prove out in terms of like the data. And so again, for that reason, I feel like Josh Jacobs at 26 years old, you're getting him on a 4-year deal. I'm projecting you're getting him for at least the next 2 years. And there really just isn't competition to steal the primary touches away from him. It's AJ Dillon and Marshawn Lloyd will have backup roles, but this is AJ Dillon. This is Josh Jacobs' backfield.
Can I change you some food?
Oh. Don't mind if I do.
Thank you, brother.
No. Thank you.
The next draft value for me is in the round 4, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. I am in love with James Cook. The fact that they pivoted to Joe Brady, the new offensive coordinator, and more of a run game and went away from Stephon Diggs. And that's why we really saw the decline of Stephon Diggs through the last part of the season, was an absolute boost to James Cook. Now, yes, in the very, very last games of the season, when they were clearly trying to limit his touches to save him for the playoffs, it didn't show out. But you look at weeks 14 and 15 against Dallas and Kansas City were the two teams. They were his two best performances of the year. He finished RB2 both weeks. He is going to be, in my mind, the actual primary weapon for this offense. Like, yes, the primary passing weapon is Dalton Kincaid, who I also do like, but with Dalton Kincaid, he's being drafted very high. He's basically going after Trey McBride off the board, to the point of I've seen him go ahead of Travis Kelce, who I also love as a draft value this year. But James Cook specifically, coming off a season where I think very quietly he had 1,500 all-purpose yards. He had, on 237 carries, 1,122 yards, 2 touchdowns, and then he also had 44 receptions for 445 yards and 4 touchdowns. He has relatively no competition. I know people love Ray Davis. I see people getting a lot of Ray Davis shares. There is a role for a Ray Davis or a Frank Gore Jr. who they brought in as well. To me, that doesn't take away from what James Cook does and what he potentially is going to do for this offense. And if they do use him a little bit more around the goal line, or even not necessarily in the goal line, within 5 yards, but even just within 10, 20 yards of the goal line, if they use him a little bit more in the passing game, especially because now suddenly you only have Keon Coleman, Mac Snack Hollins, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel as like your wide receiver core. I just think James Cook potentially, you talk about a guy who has that potential to crack the top 5. I think James Cook is legitimately one of those players. You talk about, again, he has the opportunity to be not just the primary running back, but to me, the primary weapon on one of the best teams in the AFC, competing for a playoff spot with a good offensive line, good coaching, and Josh Allen as your quarterback. And I think Josh Allen is he's always going to run. Obviously, that's part of his game. I do think last year there was a part of him that started to realize, especially down the stretch, that he is going to need to utilize James Cook out of the backfield more. We'll see how that actually plays out in theory this year. But even if you told me he's just going to repeat essentially what he was doing from the time that Joe Brady took over, even again, the fact that he had 1,500 all-purpose yards for the whole season, even with the early season struggles, just tells you the potential that he has. And again, at his age and his situation, projecting a running back that you're going to be able to have as a core of your running back, as a central figure of your running back core, you're going to be able to keep him for 2, probably 3 years, maybe a little bit more. So, running backs in Dynasty, it's not just that the guys are hard to find. You can get late values on James Conner and those type of players, but James Conner's already 29 years old. Aaron Jones already 28, 29 years old. So you're not going to have those guys for very long. whereas you might get a little bit more leash out of a James Cook, not just because you'll be able to have that player for 2-3 years, but you will be able to maximize the trade value of James Cook at 26 years old versus trying to trade, James Conner at 31 years old. But we will get into a bit of an older guy for this next one. In round 5, the King, Derrick Henry, newly acquired of the Baltimore Ravens, went at 5'8" in my single quarterback, 6'12" in the super flex. The King has a new home in Baltimore where Gus Bus just had 13 touchdowns. What else do we need to talk about here? Like, over under 11 touchdowns for Derrick Henry, I will take the over 9 times out of 10. To me, this is like one of the most guaranteed, obviously barring injury. If he plays the season out, to me, this is a guaranteed lock for double-digit touchdowns and 1,000-yard season. Derrick Henry is a freak of nature. I know the age is concerning, but I think there are a few players like Derrick Henry who could play through and be as effective, especially at the running back position at age 30, 31, 32. I think Derrick Henry is the ultimate outlier. So I love the draft capital. I love the situation. And I'm frankly not afraid of the age or the cliff. And, even if it comes in 2 to 3 years, I would be willing to just have Derrick Henry fade. Like, if he's going to fade anywhere, he's going to be relevant for your fantasy team, fading for the Baltimore Ravens over any other squad. But I actually think that he is going to be a true dominator for the next 2 seasons, especially the way that they are ultimately going to use him around the goal line. It's going to be silly. We'll get right into round 6. Devontae Adams is dropping way too far in drafts, and that is just chump change, easy money, baby.
Come on, baby. Come on. Yes.
Hey, it worked.
All right. Easy money. Come on.
Man, Devontae Adams is absolutely still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and I do not give a single solitary fuck that he is 31 years old. When you're talking about a guy at the level of a Devontae Adams, you can favorably compare him to like a Larry Fitzgerald, who, again, Larry Fitz, I think people don't realize, was still putting up viable fantasy relevant seasons at age like 33, 34. He really tapered off at like 34, 35 years old. You have other guys historically, obviously like the Tim Browns and the Jerry Rices of the world who played until they were fucking 40 years old. But even like as recently as Steve Smith Jr., I believe it was in 2018 for the Ravens, put up 1,000-yard season at 35 years old. So just because Devontae Adams is 31, to me, doesn't mean that he's dead. I feel like he still has at least, again, 2 quality years as a wide receiver in this league. And, you look at last season, he had 175 targets, and, a lot of them weren't great targets because he only had 103 receptions. So even if you were to bring the targets down a little bit, but make them more efficient targets, because you either have Aiden Hill going into his second season or Gardner Minshew, who to me is like a slightly above average NFL quarterback, then, he could easily repeat 103 receptions. And he had 1,144 yards and 8 touchdowns. Like, again, going in the 6th round is just ludicrous. So to me, that's just easy money. Round 7. This one hurts, but I feel like it is the right call.
Damn!
You guys, I'm addicted to Najee Harris. I just can't give this man up. There's like the tweet going around of why can't I drop this player? And if I had to do that, it would be Najee Harris, except like Najee Harris is young. He's 26 years old. But the thing about Najee is, obviously he's not a burner. But when you give him 15 plus carries, he usually will deliver. I looked at his game logs from last year. The magic number really was 15. When he had under 15 carries, generally speaking, it was a bad game, not just for fantasy, but like in real life too. He's very much like a body puncher. So it was a combination of two things. It's the fact that Najee Harris is like a body puncher. It's also you have to use him in the right style of offense. And too often last year, they were trying to use him in a Jaylen Warren type role. So Jaylen Warren, more of a pass catching style running back, operates well out of shotgun formations. You can use him on draw plays and screens and that kind of stuff. That's not really Najee's game. Najee's game is power offense. Now, he can definitely catch the ball. We saw that his first season when he had like 75 receptions out of the backfield. But again, it's out of a power offense. It's a very different style of offense. Those are a lot of more times like, just running back leaks and sweeps out of the backfield in terms of like the route that he's running. They're not draw plays. They're not cut plays. They're not things that are requiring him to, finesse his way through the offensive line or around it to then settle back underneath the zone. You're not asking him to do high-level pass concepts. He is capable of catching the ball, but that's not his game. So Arthur Smith, this is hilarious because, again, last year I was so out on Arthur Smith and his offense and what that meant for Bijan Robinson and Drake London and Kyle Pitts. And I thought Drake London actually could be the outlier just because of his historicity with the Tennessee Titans and A.J. Brown, but even that didn't pan out. But I will say Arthur Smith, he runs the exact style of offense that we need for the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's a 2 tight end heavy set offense. He runs the highest percentage of 2 tight end sets in the NFL. It's very much like a power style offense. That's why Tyler Algier, very much fit the role of the grinder and, succeeded in that offense. Najee Harris is a better version of Tyler Algier. I think people are going to be disappointed in the usage of Jaylen Warren in an Arthur Smith offense. I think they're going to be surprised by the usage of Najee Harris, and especially because there's conjecture right now that Najee Harris could even leave the Steelers because they didn't pick up his 5th-year option. The Steelers could just as easily sign him to a long-term deal because they just want to avoid having to pay the guaranteed, I think it was $6 or $7 million if they picked up the option. Whereas, they could just as easily re-sign him to a 3-year deal with, like 10 million guaranteed or whatever. So you don't, instead of having to eat that extra 5th-year option and pay him, and then nobody's happy, ultimately, like maybe they just resign, maybe they let him go to free agency. We'll kind of see what happens, but that is a little bit of a risk, but that risk is now baked into the fact that you're taking him in round 7. So if you are taking Najee Harris, he's young enough, and I think he is good enough that in power offenses, he can succeed and be a primary running back in the NFL. The problem is that those type of offenses are obviously much fewer and further between than they were back in the 90s and even early 2000s, even late 2000s, to be honest. Najee Harris is the type of running back that would fit perfectly with the Los Angeles Chargers and Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh's offense. So, again, it's interesting to see what will happen this year with Arthur Smith and potentially what happens with Najee Harris and the rest of his career. at around 7 ADP, I'm willing to take that risk. And, you know, again, maybe he's just the player that I can't quit and that I'll ultimately always be wrong on. But for right now, I feel like, you know, last year you were having to take him in round 3 or 4, and I thought that was an excellent value, and I ended up being wrong. He did definitely pick it up towards the last half of the season, and I do feel a little biased because as a Steelers fan, I do really always kind of really take a shine to the Steelers running backs and linebackers in particular. But yeah, round 7 ADP, though, that's kind of hard to ignore. And in a super flex, he went at round 8. So it was 8 points. So even a little extra value in a super flex league. But even for a single quarterback league, to get him as potentially a 7th round running back, like, you know, you're taking a shot on a guy who's potentially a starting running back. And if it clicks with the Arthur Smith power offense, I actually think that could be, you know, really viable and wildly outproduce his ADP. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. Though I will say after last year, it definitely is harder to do and it doesn't feel as good as it did. Round 8, we'll go back to the wide receivers here with Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Thank you, God.
So Chris Godwin, coming off a tough year, still somehow managed 83 receptions on 130 targets, did barely cross the 1,000-yard threshold, had 1,024 yards, only 2 touchdowns. So there is definitely also room for positive touchdown regression. I think the biggest thing, though, is, and they just recently announced, did the Buccaneers coaching staff, that they plan to move Chris Godwin back into a slot role next year, that he will play primarily and the majority of his snaps out of the slot. They did re-sign him. So he is, you know, he's with the Bucs and he's only 28 years old. So I think Chris Godwin at a round 8 ADP, that could potentially be a massive value, especially as like, you know, when you're talking about round 8, now you're talking about a guy that you're taking as like your wide receiver 3, or you talk about, you know, or what I've been talking about this whole time is that a lot of these guys I've gone running back heavy. It's like, if you wait until around 7 and get Najee Harris as your running back 1, that doesn't feel great. However, if he's like your running back 3 because you went Bijan, Josh Jacobs, or James Cook, or Derrick Henry, and then you decide, oh, I'm going to take a shot on Najee, you notice, hey, I'm a little light at wide receiver here. That Chris Godwin is an absolutely perfect wide receiver 3 right now that I think has wide receiver 2 potential. And in a dynasty league, especially, you know, he's already 28 years old, so the timing doesn't really line up the greatest of if Mike Evans should retire in 2 years. Chris Godwin at that point will be 30 years old. And you imagine that they would have brought in like a rookie wide receiver at that point, or, you know, somebody else via trade that's younger. So I don't think you really have that path where you can say, oh, the potential of Chris Godwin to become a true wide receiver 1 in this league. But him moving back into the slot, I definitely think is going to be great for his value. And again, I see the ability for positive touchdown regression. I see a 2-year path with them having re-signed Baker Mayfield. And again, just the idea of him moving back into his natural slot role is very enticing. So I do think that that is going to be a slam dunk.
Do you want to see me dunk?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay. Are you guys ready? I'm okay. Don't worry.
Does that always happen?
So in round 9, this to me is you have to get a tight end in this round. And this is especially true in single quarterback, but in super flex even, this really is kind of the round where the last of the potential premier tight ends go off the board. So, whether you're really into David Njoku or an Evan Ingram or whoever it may be, those guys will usually go off the board right around here. The guy that I think I sneakily, quietly like the most is Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. You talk about the Dallas Cowboys had arguably one of the worst off seasons as far as like an NFL team because they didn't do jack shit. They didn't bring anybody in. Well, that's great news for Jake Ferguson because that basically means that he is the second target behind CeeDee Lamb. And now you're talking about he is going into his third year. So there's always, again, tight ends take a little bit longer to acclimate in the NFL. That third year leap for a tight end is similar to potentially a second year leap for a wide receiver. And he is coming off a really quietly good year. Finished top 10 last year with 71 receptions on 102 targets, 761 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And he's only 25 years old. So he's attached to essentially an ideal passing situation, a good quarterback in Dak Prescott. Whether you believe that or not, as far as fantasy goes, Dak Prescott is a good, viable fantasy quarterback. And again, he has a massive opportunity. It's like, to me, the pecking order on this team is CeeDee Lamb, Jake Ferguson, and Brandon Cooks. Especially because you're now talking about you're replacing Tony Pollard, who at least had some receiving juice out of the backfield, with Ezekiel Elliott returning to town. So again, to me, this is very much a huge opportunity for Jake Ferguson. I think he's going to crack top 10 again at around 9 ADP in single quarterback, round 10 in Superflex. This is just absolutely a tremendous value, and it's just being overlooked, it feels like, because again, people are very enamored with the Trey McBrides and the Dalton Kincaids and the Brock Bowers, and yet again, Jake Ferguson coming off a top 10 year last year, I could see him beating basically all of these numbers. If he sees 125 to 150 targets and is able to flirt with 1,000 yards receiving, maybe 7-8 touchdowns, he could even fuck around and find himself in a top 5 tight end position. Because again, they need someone besides CeeDee Lamb to throw to in Dallas, and I think Jake Ferguson could potentially continue to ascend in his role within that offense. And I do think, as it sits right now, he's the number 2 guy in the pecking order in terms of air targets. So I am definitely hammering Jake Ferguson in a lot of my drafts, especially, the drafts basically where I didn't take the value on Travis Kelce, who I feel is falling again also because of his age, but still you have to take him in about round 4, maybe 5 if you're really lucky, but usually it's like mid round 4 still. Like Jake Ferguson going in the 9th round, that's just, it's easy money, like I said a couple times on this show so far. And we will wrap up with round 10 running back out of New York. This guy, this is really a value of necessity. Devin Singletary last season, when he was with the Houston Texans, showed that when he's the only game in town, he can be fantasy relevant. It was his first season ever over 200 carries. He had 216 carries for 898 yards and 4 touchdowns. He also had 30 receptions for 193 receiving yards. So he did actually crack 1,000 all-purpose yards last season, and finds himself now with the New York Giants, where Saquon Barkley is gone. Darren Waller even could potentially retire. And so you're talking about a bit of a reset with Malik Neighbors coming in as their number 1 draft pick. So he is going to be the primary target. But then Devin Singletary, probably the secondary weapon on this team. I would imagine is going to see the majority of the running back carries. The running back room, yes, Tyrone Tracy is an interesting draft prospect. He was a 6th round pick, though. I love him as a sleeper. Suddenly, though, he seems like everybody's favorite sleeper. His actual real life value in terms of how it negates Devin Singletary, I don't think it's applicable. The reason I like Tyrone Tracy so much is because he did play formerly as a wide receiver, and I think he could carve out potentially a passing role. But I think Devin Singletary, for at least this year, is going to have the entire, not the entire, but he's going to have the majority of the running back carries to himself this year. So especially if you're building a win now roster, so there is different ways of attacking a dynasty draft. Lots of people like to attack where they will collect future draft picks, draft a lot of young players, try to build out for a future. I don't do that. I do the complete opposite, actually. When I go in drafting thinking I am going to win a championship this year, the goal of Dynasty Fantasy Football is still to win championships, you guys. And I'm fine rebuilding my team on the fly. If I need to do a full teardown to rebuild, I'm comfortable doing that a couple of years from now. But I want to win now. I don't want to draft. I'm not in this draft so I can draft so that maybe I might win in 3 years. No. I'm here to win now. So most of the time, I will be drafting guys like Devin Singletary because even if they only produce for this year and potentially next year, that's fine. That's what I want. And even if he does that, I mean, he's not an old running back. He's 26 years old. Doesn't have a ton of tread on the tire. If he can prove himself in New York and then find another role, I can still trade him when he's 28. So I really love Devin Singletary here in round 10, especially because at that point, you're starting to take a lot of shots on like random dudes that might not even have a starting role. Whereas like I would, or even like 2nd round rookies that, it's conjecture of if they even are able to do anything in the NFL. And we've seen lots and lots of draft busts. Give me the guy that's already proven in the NFL in a sense and has like a lock on a starting role. And people just don't want him because he's kind of a boring veteran. So that's it for our 10 rounds of draft values. I'm going to rapid fire these ones right here. These are just my favorite draft values by position. I used single quarterback rankings for the skill players. Only the quarterbacks did I use Superflex rankings. So here we go. Quarterback. Dak Prescott at 3.2. Jared Goff at 3.7. Kirk Cousins at 7.11. Getting a slushie. Baker Mayfield at 8.6. Matthew Stafford at 9.4. Geno Smith at 11.9. And even if you want to take kind of a developmental shot, I like Justin Fields at 11.2. If you want to take the chance that maybe the Steelers are able to develop his passing game and he eventually becomes our starter, I like that potential enough that I would take that risk in the 11th round. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But if it does, you essentially got a potentially 1st round Superflex quarterback, but you got him in the 11th round. That is a tremendous value. So that is a risk I would be willing to take. And again, those were all Superflex draft spots. Those were the literal draft spots of where those players were drafted in the Dynasty Superflex startup that I am doing right now, which includes rookies, by the way. And then the running back, wide receiver, tight end. These are all single quarterback. This is off the mock draft that I did. So DeAndre Swift at 5'4", Joe Mixon at 6'1". I love Joe Mixon this year. Talk about Devin Singletary had that role last year and was able to produce. Joe Mixon is better than Devin Singletary, in my opinion. So I think he will be a great value this year in the 6th round. He's definitely someone I'm targeting in the cases where I am going wide receiver heavy early. David Montgomery at 6'12", just a perennial value. Tony Pollard. I'm not enamored with Tony Pollard or his role with the Tennessee Titans and potentially splitting it with Tajay snap percentage Spears, but at 7-2, I'm willing to take that risk in a single quarterback league. Najee, we talked about Najee already. Aaron Jones at 8-5, Zamir White at 8-8, James Conner at 9-3, I fucked that up too. Raheem Mostert at 11-4. That's the last one. For wide receivers, DK Metcalf at 4-2, Deebo Samuel at 5-9 is egregious. Like, if Brandon Ayuk gets traded sometime this offseason, Deebo Samuel is only going to see even a little bit more of a boost. And even if Brandon Ayuk stays, that offense primarily runs through Deebo Samuel and his duality as, you know, what he's able to do with obviously as a wide receiver, but also like out of the run game with the jet sweeps and all the stuff that Kyle Shanahan likes to do. So at 5'9", I love that. Mike Evans at 5'11", again, that's pure age. It's pure ageism. Mike Evans has literally never had less than 1,000-yard wide. He has never had less than 1,000-yard season as a wide receiver. Like, that's guaranteed value, it feels like. Terry McLaurin at 7'6" is hilarious. He just got a quarterback upgrade in Jaden Daniels. Amari Cooper at 7'9", he's going to outproduce that. Deontay Johnson. I'm not even a big Deontay Johnson fan, but at 9'5", you talk about the only real other wide receiver threats on that team is 33-year-old Adam Thielen. There's a name that you can be a little ageist with. I love Adam Thielen. I do think he will produce for like 6 games this year at the beginning of the season, but he will taper off. And then, you know, they drafted Xavier Legette and they still have Jonathan Mingo. It's like Deontay Johnson is a different type of wide receiver than all of those other guys. He actually most closely fills the Adam Thielen role, which is funny because Adam Thielen, I'm projecting, will be gone next year. So I love Deontay Johnson there. And Cortland Sutton at 10-10. It's like, who else is on this team? Troy Franklin. Like, he's going to be the primary wide receiver. He caught 10 touchdowns last year. And Tyler Lockett, just every single year, Tyler Lockett gets disrespected. Right now going at 11-12 in the 11th round. Draft Tyler Lockett, wait 5 weeks for him to produce, and then go look for who's 5-0 and just trade him to a contender and get as much as you can for Tyler Lockett. I do that every year in especially redraft leagues, but I feel like you could get away with it in a dynasty league. And that's just like one of my favorite moves. Draft Tyler Lockett so you can trade him halfway through the season for value. And at tight end, kind of touched on it a little bit. Travis Kelce falling into the round 4, went at 4.6. Guys, he just re-signed a 2-year deal. If you have Travis Kelce for 2 more years, I'm pretty sure he's still going to finish as a top 5 tight end both of those years. And when you are able to get him at 4.6, now you're getting the actual discount that you were not getting last year when you had to take him in the first round. So I like that. And then Kyle Pitts at 5'2", obviously with Kirk Cousins and a new offense. I am projecting him to have finally a resurgent bounce back season, especially because he should be fully healthy this year. Speaking of fully healthy, Mark Andrews is going at 5'5". I feel like the only reason Mark Andrews is being dragged is because he got injured last season. It's like if he plays a full healthy season, he will compete for the number 1 tight end spot. He is still the primary passing weapon for Lamar Jackson in that offense. We saw it when he was healthy. And we even saw it with Isaiah Likely, honestly. And then Evan Ingram at 9'9". I love Evan Ingram. That's probably like my very last tight end that I'm willing to walk away with as my tight end 1 in Dynasty fantasy football drafts. And that is it for me. I appreciate you guys making your way through this show. I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I know there's a lot of Dynasty startup drafts, so that's why I want to sneak this episode in and take a break from doing the underdog drafts because I do love doing those. I will be doing definitely more of those episodes in the future. But again, it's Dynasty season, so, you know, I had to drop in a little bit of Dynasty content for you guys. I might be a schmuck, but hey, there's a little method to the madness, you guys. So if you want to help support the show, I've said a million times, there's no ads, there's no sponsors, no bullshit. All I need is just little taparoo of that like and subscribe button. If you guys want to send some comments, some questions, some ideas for the show, hit me up at Jack Lusney, all my socials, or worstsportschannel@gmail.com. And I'll catch all of you guys on the flip side.
He's running down the middle by the 50. He's at the 30. He's bare-chested and banging his chest. Now he runs the opposite way. He runs at the 50. He runs at the 40. The guy is drunk, but there he goes. The 20. They're chasing him. They're not going to get him. Waving his arms, bare-chested. Somebody stop that man.